But first, painful divisions that many Americans thought the country had moved past were brought to the surface after the recent presidential election. In fact, the Southern Poverty Law Center has been keeping a running tab on a spike in hate incidents across the country. Special correspondent Duarte Geraldino reports tonight from an area outside Atlanta where lingering racial scars are still being examined for lessons on how to move forward. And a warning, the story contains some graphic and offensive language.
In 1987, race and class divisions erupted as African-American leaders and their supporters tried to march through Forsyth County, Georgia, an area just 40 miles north of Atlanta.
Where did the people who come from who were shouting, "Nigger, go home"?
A moment of extreme division captured in one of Oprah Winfrey's first shows. She came to Forsyth after it was thrust into the global spotlight because an unspoken ban on black people was, all at once, being exposed, challenged, and proudly defended.
My name's Frank Shirley. I'm the head of the committee to keep Forsyth and Dawson County white. There were thousands of white people that came out to join our white people's protest.
First time anyone, including myself, had seen black faces in Forsyth County.
Yet there were also whites in the area like Patrick Phillips, who joined African Americans to oppose the ban. He was just 17 at the time.
All around me, all of these people started, chanting white power. And at that point, I realized that I had stumbled my way into the middle of the Klan's victory celebration for having stopped the march.
At that point, what goes through your mind?
I was horrified and kind of shocked.
Phillips says the march came at a time when the community was feeling pressure from what it considered outsiders, a time when speaking up against the racial ban could make you a target.
I still feel a little bit nervous talking about all of this openly now.
But lately he's been doing a lot of talking about his childhood in North Georgia and how his experience can help all Americans make sense of today.
What's happened in the last couple of months, the ugliness of the campaign, the racial rhetoric, and the divisiveness. And I think there are people who want to interpret that as a kind of wrong turning in America. I think the other way to interpret it is really more of a revelation of some currents that have been there all along.
Phillips is the author of Blood at the Root, a racial cleansing in America. The book is his way of making sense of the place where he grew up.
The story that I was told, the myth was very simple. White people rose up, they drove out their black neighbors, they were kept out for 100 years. What I now know is the racial cleansing in 1912.
We followed his trail of discovery. It begins here at a cemetery beside Pleasant Grove Baptist Church just outside of Cumming, Georgia.
What is this?
So this is the grave of Mae Crow.
She comes into the story of Forsyth County's racial cleansing because on September 8th, 1912, she disappeared in the woods about a mile from her house. And all hell broke loose in Forsyth County on the day of Mae Crow's funeral.
According to various accounts, 18-year-old Mae Crow is walking alone in the woods when she's struck repeatedly with a rock, reportedly sexually assaulted and left for dead.
She was hit so hard that her eye was dislodged from her skull and left hanging.
She's always kind of center.
Debbie Vermont is Mae Crow's grandniece. She keeps a portrait of her in her living room.
My grandmother always said that she was known to be the prettiest girl in Forsyth County.
Word of the attack spread quickly. Suspicion soon fell on a group of young African Americans. Local media condemned them, describing the trio as, quote, the fiendish, low-browed, gorilla-type Negroes. Enraged by the news, a mob immediately lynched one man.
You believe that some of your distant relatives took part in this lynching?
Yes, some of them I am fairly sure they did. These were the most aggrieved and grieving, who wanted justice for what had happened to their loved one.
Two others, both teenagers, were arrested, tried, and convicted. A prominent doctor volunteered land near his home for the court-ordered execution. An estimated 5,000 people showed up to watch the hangings.
Well, my grandmother would have been 18 months old, sitting in her mother's lap.
Watching someone being lynched?
Right.
So do you believe that those three people, the two teenagers, the one young man in his 20s, do you believe they were innocent?
I do believe they were innocent. I do believe. And I believe it's a huge cold case that's still sitting there to try to figure out exactly who did it.
Stories like this were common in the Jim Crow South, but what was unique in this case is what happened next. Newspapers of the day describe a series of late-night attacks on black families, a campaign of terror by whites.
The Night Riders won. It worked. They succeeded in their goal of driving out the entire black community.
More than 1,000 African Americans banished.
They largely erased all the signs that that community had ever been there.
At one point, this land belonged to the black community of Forsyth County.
But not everything was erased. Phillips has spent 10 years looking for physical evidence of Forsyth's black community, remains of burnt-out churches and lands from which African Americans were driven off.
Why is it so difficult to find all this stuff?
Well, I have a land lot number, and that's it.
Today, much of this land is high-priced real estate, but when Phillips first came, it was a different place.
In 1977, when my family moved to Forsyth, the place was changing quite a bit. The completion of Highway 400 in the mid-1970s suddenly made Forsyth viable as a bedroom community for people, for professional people working in Atlanta.
Those newcomers weren't always welcome, though. At the time, fewer than 40,000 people lived here, and some were willing to use extreme measures to protect their way of life. Today, more than 200,000 people live in Forsyth, and thanks to a surge in new businesses and high-paying jobs, it's one of the wealthiest counties in the nation.
To successfully erase this kind of land theft, to ignore its impact over generations, is really damaging. Come on up, Duarte.
Phillips' search did turn up one major marker. Remember the home of the wealthy landowner who volunteered his backyard for the public hangings in 1912? It's been meticulously restored and now houses the local Chamber of Commerce. James McCoy is the Chamber CEO.
You know, the events in, particularly in 1987, it was a soul-searching moment for this community. Much of that was driven by the business community.
Since 1987, the Chamber's membership has evolved, moving from mostly mom-and-pop businesses to larger corporations explicitly bound by the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
We went from probably a little over 90% being micro-enterprises, one or two employees, to companies that are more in the mid-range business of anywhere between 25 and 200 employees.
You can measure just how far Forsyth has come by the candidacy of Democrat Daniel Blackman. He ran to represent the county in the Georgia State Senate.
Well, I didn't win, but we got 21% of the vote. I'm almost positive to say that, you know, some white folks voted for me. So the fact that I'm in this county and we were able to run and I'm a black candidate, I think that really speaks volumes, and it shows that we are going in the right direction.
Still, less than 5% of all Forsyth residents are black. Yet unlike many African Americans before him, Blackman is vowing to stay. He owns a strategic communications business and is raising his family here.
I'm not going anywhere for a long time.
But for Phillips and Vermont, the weight of their Forsyth roots are too heavy. Both moved up north decades ago.
We were raised with this notion that every day America gets a little bit more just. Every day the wheels of progress kind of move forward. And I think, you know, in the research, I learned that what that leaves out is that sometimes the gains of one generation are given back in the next.
Because down there, nobody wanted to talk about it.
Vermont now lives in the Philadelphia area and gives talks to mostly white groups on the lessons of her family's past and what it means for today. I asked her if she feels the country has moved past the kinds of racial conflict that Forsyth experienced.
No. There are still so many places that are white enclaves. We are still a very segregated country.
Confirming the reasons Vermont was so fearful, the Southern Poverty Law Center has documented more than 1,000 incidents of racial intimidation since the presidential election. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Duarte Geraldino in Forsyth County, Georgia.
5:30, we are all new at 5:30. We are taking a closer look at an all-black town in Georgia called Oscarville.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about this on social media for the last few years, and if you haven't heard of it, it's probably because it no longer exists. It's buried under Lake Lanier. 11 Alive's Latasha Gibbons has more.
When we started working on this story, we set out to track down descendants of Oscarville. Weeks later, we found a family who could trace back their roots 4 generations. They shared with us stories that were handed down about what the all-black town was like, including the night that led to its destruction. It was set on fire by night riders after they say a white woman was raped. Then later, it was covered by the body of water we now know as Lake Lanier. May Crow is buried here at this Gainesville cemetery, but the trail of destruction following her death stretches into the land surrounding Forsyth County, buried beneath these waves of Lake Lanier, where in 1912 nearly every black resident was forced out. That includes people living in an old black town called Oscarville. The community was formed in the late 1800s during the Reconstruction era.
There was a very strong community feeling among the blacks. About 300 children that went to some of the schools that were the black schools, and it was closely connected to the churches.
Georgia history teacher Lisa Crosby says Oscarville was a thriving black community, full of carpenters, blacksmiths, and bricklayers, but farming was the top trade.
So they really had kind of a miraculous farming growth here while the rest of the state was really struggling.
But then residents were abruptly forced off their land.
So the flashpoint, I think, is 1912.
This takes us back to the death of May Crow. The 19-year-old white woman was found dead in the woods near Oscarville, presumably after being raped.
Typically, the answer to white girls being raped was go to the black community and just start blaming people.
By nightfall, terror began to reign over Oscarville.
So from there, the rage and hatred in the community, mobs got together and they were called night riders, and they were riding throughout Oscarville and driving out the black community.
And the night turned deadly. You know, they were waking up by fires outside, fire bombs thrown in the church.
Filmmaker Bob Mackey recaptures those horrific nights in an upcoming television series.
Anytime anything happened, guess where everyone would go? To the church. Well, they attacked the church. People were hung, lynched.
Mackey's series features stories of direct descendants like George Rucker, who can trace his family back 4 generations to Oscarville. He tells the story of his great-grandfather, Bert Oliver, and the entire family being forced off their land.
Night riders came through. They had to leave everything. The main thing they left was property, and my grandfather had 100 acres.
Rucker says many relatives died as they tried to flee.
So when they got to the Chattahoochee River, from what I understand, they were told, when the mob got up on the bridge, they were told that they either had to swim or drown. Most of them didn't make it. My grandfather, one of them that did make it, he lost some brothers and sisters.
He says his relatives who survived settled in Gainesville.
From what my mother told me, Bert Oliver, he would sit and tell her this story, and he would just sit and cry.
Crosby says whites in the area took over the remaining properties. She says Oscarville farmers were specifically skilled in raising poultry, which set the pace for Gainesville eventually becoming poultry capital of the world.
You have a farm already going, and you had free land, so you just take it.
Rucker says his great-grandfather married his second wife, Beulah, and they built this school that still stands in Gainesville today. By the late 1950s, the Beaufort Dam was built and Lake Lanier was formed, covering up Oscarville and swallowing most of its history. Many believe Lake Lanier is haunted because of the high number of drownings. We spoke to officials who tell us because there is an entire town that includes structures and even forest areas with trees that are 60 feet tall, it makes it more difficult to navigate through, and someone can easily become trapped in debris, leading them to drowning. We have so much more on this story on our website.
Lake Lanier is a man-made lake, or reservoir, in the northern part of Georgia. It encompasses 59 miles of water, and it's absolutely massive. The lake was created back in 1956 to control flooding of the Chattahoochee River and to provide drinking water for residents of Atlanta. But the story of this lake seems to be cursed, with darkness tainting the land even before it would become a lake. Before Lake Lanier was created, the land which now sits at the bottom of the water was lush, vibrant, and full of life. Lots of animals and wildlife called this area home, and so did a number of people. One community that once existed on the land that Lake Lanier now covers was a small village called Oscarville. At one point, Oscarville was home to over 1,098 black residents. It was a town where African American individuals could really thrive, and they had built up their own powerful community in a county known for its racism. But events in the early 20th century would change that. In 1912, a white woman named May Crow was found in the woods near the community, beaten almost to death, and she had been sexually assaulted. She died a short while after the discovery of her body, and the crime was immediately believed by the local white community to have been perpetrated by a black man. So residents essentially rounded up any black men that they could find in the area, and they arrested them. Eventually, 4 people had been arrested. A man named Rob Edwards, his wife Jane Daniel, her brother Oscar Daniel, and their cousin, a 16-year-old boy named Ernest Knox. Rob Edwards, shortly after his arrest, was drugged from the jail by a white mob and lynched on a nearby telephone pole. The crowd then proceeded to fire hundreds of bullets freely into his body while he hung from the pole. Soon after, both Ernest Knox and Oscar Daniel were found guilty of the assault and murder of May Crow after a one-day trial. They were taken from the jailhouse and also immediately hanged. It's estimated that over 5,000 people gathered from nearby communities to watch the hangings of these 2 men that day. And it's been said that the people there watching this brutal crime happen were celebrating. Weeks before these incidents, another local woman named Ellen Grice had claimed that she had awoken and, according to her, this is a quote, found a Negro man in her bed. This led to a local black preacher being whipped and beaten in the town square. He was also nearly lynched, but narrowly escaped being murdered. After all of this racial violence, a group of white men associated with the KKK who named themselves the Night Riders began to burn down black churches, black-owned businesses, and black-inhabited houses in the area in an attempt to scare people of color out of town. They would appear in the night and set fire to these structures, or even fire bullets into the windows of homes. They would even post notices in certain areas, alerting folks that they had 24 hours to leave before their property would be burned or they would become victimized by violence. And eventually, these scare tactics worked. Within 2 months, virtually every black resident in Oscarville, almost all 1,098 of them, had fled the area. It was essentially an ethnic cleansing, and Oscarville, after its abandonment, became a ghost town. So, fast forward to the 1950s when the Army Corps of Engineers sets their sights on the area and wants to begin the construction of Lake Lanier. Property owners who still remained in the area were offered small sums of money for their property and were eventually forced out of the ancestral homes that had been in their families at this point for generations. Some 700 families and many businesses that had been in these families for decades were forced to relocate in the effort to construct the reservoir. And the money that these families were paid for their land ended up being too small of a sum to survive off of. Lots of these displaced residents were forced to leave the county and area altogether and find somewhere cheaper to live because they simply couldn't afford to live near there anymore. When the Army Corps of Engineers began construction on the lake, they destroyed and removed most of the structures that were once there. Churches were destroyed. Houses, for the most part, were demolished. It took 5 years for the lake to fill with water to the point that the Corps of Engineers wanted it to fill to, and as the mountain foothills in the area filled with this surging water, the unstoppable spread of the lake devoured entire towns, along with their buildings and houses, farmlands, fields, bridges, toll gates, historical landmarks, river ferry businesses, a racetrack called Looper Speedway, country roads, forests, and even other lakes. Thousands upon thousands of animals drowned in this process, and I'm assuming millions of insects that once called the dirt and grounds that would become the bottom of this new lake home. That, in my mind, had to leave a massive stain. Eerily, the Army Corps of Engineers also relocated a total of 20 cemeteries that were in the area, so that they could fill the space with water. Bodies were dug up and moved to new burial grounds, but it's said that a number of the headstones were left underwater, whether by mistake or on purpose. And this is one of the many reasons why people claim that the lake is haunted or cursed. Cesar Yabor, a spokesman for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, told CNN in an interview last year that many unmarked graves and burials, whether from local residents or indigenous tribes that had been forced out of the area years before, are probably still there underneath the waters of the lake. The technological capability to identify and verify unmarked burial sites through subsurface scanning or other means was far less robust 70 years ago, Yabor told CNN. While the Corps made every effort at the time to locate unmarked burials, he added, the limited capabilities of the time make it probable that unanticipated finds of human remains are possible, whether from the antebellum and Civil War periods or of Native American origin from pre-colonial and ancient times. That's absolutely insane to me, that the government is literally admitting that they probably flooded graves while they were constructing Lake Lanier, where they remain unmarked and forgotten to this day. Who knows how many corpses lie nowadays under the dark waters of the reservoir? It's hard to say. Now, onto the legends and hauntings of the lake. Lake Lanier has been a magnet for death ever since it was created, and it continues to be to this day. Since 1965, it's been reported that over 675 people have died in Lake Lanier. Many of their bodies have never been recovered. Another member of the Army Corps of Engineers, Nicholas Baggett, claimed in an interview that there have been hundreds of drownings and boat accidents on the lake. He also confirmed in the interview that some of the bodies are still there underwater. He also said that without a body, there's no closure for family members who have one of their own die in this body of water. There have been some victims of drownings that have not been recovered, said Baggett during the interview. In 2017, longtime diver Buck Buchanan told local media that he sometimes feels body parts in the lake during his excursions. You reach out into the dark and you feel an arm or a leg, and it doesn't move, he said. And I don't know exactly what Buck is referring to there. I don't know if he's just talking about stuff on the bottom of the lake or if he's actually, found and felt a body, but it's still just a very eerie quote. And the amount of deaths in this lake is just bizarre. And when you look at the specifics of some of these drownings, the deaths become even weirder. A lot of people have drowned in calm conditions, fairly close to the shore. Many who have drowned have been experienced swimmers who just randomly die. Even recently, a professional basketball player entered the water and never left it. Some individuals who have survived drownings in the lake have claimed that while they were drowning, they felt phantom hands pulling them down into the murky depths. Almost like the ghosts of the lake want to end the lives of those brave enough to swim in it. Other people who have survived drownings have allegedly claimed that they felt all of the air suddenly leave their lungs while they were underwater. Regardless, the amount of drownings in the lake is alarming, and many people in the area caution visitors from swimming in the reservoir. There have also been stories of boats just randomly capsizing in the lake. Large boats that one moment are floating peacefully in the water and the next are tipped over and sinking to the depths. Some boat captains have even reported running into large objects in the lake with their boats, but when they look down at the water to see what they hit, there's nothing there. Just the dark, open water. It's also been said that massive waves and storm systems will appear out of nowhere on the lake. One moment the weather will be calm, and only minutes later, your boat is in danger of capsizing. I don't know how the hell this could be happening, but based on the staggering amount of reports of this phenomenon occurring, it seems that indeed it is. Lake Lanier has also been a place haunted by strange disappearances, murders, and mysteries. In 2015, a man by the name of Kelly Nash awoke early in the morning in his home, complained of having flu-like symptoms to his girlfriend, and then went back to bed. At 7:30, when his girlfriend woke up, he was gone. His car keys, wallet, and ID, however, were still at home. A month later, his decomposed body was found floating in Lake Lanier, with a single gunshot wound to the head. He was still wearing the same pajama pants and dark shirt that he had on when he awoke his girlfriend early on the morning that he disappeared. It may seem like he took his own life, but many are not convinced. The mystery as to how he got to the lake and why this happened has never been solved. Another tragedy that has haunted Lake Lanier is that of two women in the late 1950s. In April of 1958, a young woman who worked at the Riverside Military Academy named Delia Parker Young and her friend Susie Roberts headed off to Three Gables in Dawsonville in Susie's 1954 Ford for a night out. They would never return. A massive search was mounted, but no bodies were found. The car was missing too. The only clue that investigators uncovered were skid marks on a bridge that crossed the lake. A while later, a fisherman made a gruesome discovery. A woman's badly decomposed corpse had floated up from the depths and had surfaced. Strangely, she was missing both hands and two toes, and she was wearing a blue dress. Unable to identify the body, the woman was buried in an unmarked grave in a local cemetery. Fast forward to the 1990s, when a construction crew working in the lake dredged up the rusted hunk of a 1954 Ford with a human body inside. Based on the possessions found in the vehicle, they were able to identify the body as missing woman Susie Roberts, and investigators then were able to identify the corpse that had been missing its hands as Delia Parker Young. It's been said that people have seen the spirit of a woman in a blue dress with no hands walking along that bridge late at night. What an eerie thought. And I'll leave you with this particularly chilling tale. According to a few local fishermen, one night while they were fishing, these two men spotted a white raft floating on the lake, being pushed by a shadowy man with a pole. On the raft, there was a lantern, swinging slowly in the night breeze. Suddenly, the man turned towards the fishermen and yelled something, But because he was so far away, the fishermen were unable to tell what he was saying. And without hesitation, the man then jumped into the dark waters of the lake and began swimming violently towards them. And as soon as the man jumped from his raft, the lantern on board extinguished, leaving the lake covered in a piercing darkness. However, when the fishermen shined their powerful flashlights into the lake, the raft, the lantern, and the man were gone.